I did what the doctor said, took the statins every morning for 11 years, and at the end of those 11 years, my cholesterol was higher than when I started. Not slightly higher, higher than my very first blood test before I'd ever taken a single pill. And my GP never once mentioned it, because technically I was within range. I'm Neil. I've got 13 years of NHS blood tests in a folder, and what I found when I finally laid them out was a pattern that nobody had shown me. In the next 10 minutes, I'll show you what my data actually tracked across those 11 years and why I think every person on a cholesterol medication deserves to see the same numbers mine showed. Because if your body is doing what a lot of bodies do on this medication, the blood test your GP is reading may not be telling the full story. First, the pattern I found across 13 years of blood tests, and the one number that most GPs don't flag, but that tells you far more about cardiovascular risk than total cholesterol alone. Then what happened in the 14 months after I stopped, and the result that made my GP ask if I'd gone back on a different medication. And then the mechanism. Why cholesterol behaves the way it does when insulin resistance is the thing nobody's treating, and what I changed to address the root rather than the symptom. We start in December 2023, the blood test that made me pull out every result I'd ever had and line them up side by side for the first time. December 2023, I opened a blood test result on my phone. NHS app, it just appears, no warning, no context, just the numbers sitting there waiting for you. Total cholesterol 8. And something felt off about that. Not a clinical alarm, nothing dramatic, just a nagging sense. I'd been on statins since 2012. Statins, 40 milligrams once a day, then estimide added on top of that a few years later. Dual medications, and 8 felt like a lot for someone who'd been on medication for over a decade. So I did something I've never thought to do before. I went and found the very first blood test, April 2012, before any medication at all. Total cholesterol 7.5. And I sat with that. I've been 11 years of medication and the numbers had gone up, not down. The cholesterol I was supposed to be being treated for was higher now than the day I started treatment. I thought I must be misreading it. Checked again. 7.5 in 2012, 8 in 2023. It wasn't a misread. Let me take you through what those 11 years actually look like when you stack the results up properly. Because a single comparison, start versus end, misses the texture of the pattern. April 2012, total cholesterol 7.5, triglycerides 3.4, outside reference range, GP note on the result, need to speak to the doctor. That's when the statin conversation started. Atorvastatin, 40 milligrams daily. I didn't question it, I was in my 40s, the number was high, the GP recommended medication, you take it. December 2016, 4 years into treatment, total cholesterol 5.3. That's the best it ever got. And to be fair, that's a meaningful drop. On paper, the medication was working. But here's where I want you to pay attention to a different number. Not the total cholesterol, the ratio. Cholesterol divided by HDL, the good cholesterol, that ratio is what some clinicians consider a far better indicator of cardiovascular risk than the headline figure. And in 2012, before any medication, my ratio was 4.7, below 5, within target. By 2016, when total cholesterol dropped to 5.3, the ratio was 4.2, improving. That's the picture the GP was looking at. Total number down, ratio improving, medication working, job done. Then something started shifting. Total cholesterol 7.3 to 7.4, back up. I was still on the medication, still taking it every morning. The number had climbed back up, close to where it was before I'd started. October 22, HbA1c 47, pre-diabetic range. That's a different marker, blood sugar. And I didn't connect it to the cholesterol at the time, but it matters for the mechanism. I'll come back to that. December 2023, total cholesterol 8. The highest it had ever been. LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, 5.6. My cholesterol HDL ratio, 6.2. That 6.2 is the number I want to stay on for a moment. In 2012, pre-medication, that ratio was 4.7. Target range is below 5. 11 years on 2 medications, it had reached 6.2. That's a 32% increase in cardiovascular risk indicator across the entire period. I was supposedly being treated for cardiovascular risk, and the reason nobody flagged it is that GPs are generally looking at total cholesterol and LDL. The ratio sits in the results. It's there, it's calculated, but it isn't always the number that prompts the conversation. Mine never did. I only noticed it in December 2023 because I went back to the 2012 baseline and compared. On that single afternoon, staring at my phone with 11 years of results in front of me, it didn't feel significant. It was more of a, that's odd, than any kind of revelation. The actual weight of what I was looking at only landed later, with reflection. But that's often how patterns work. They don't announce themselves. You notice something, file it away, and the meaning arrives later. 6 medications, statins, gout pills, asthma inhalers, allergy tablets, the lot. I stopped all of them in 2024. If documenting that kind of thing properly sounds worth following, please subscribe. February 2024, I stopped the statins, and I want to be honest about how that happened, because it wasn't a GP supervised program with a careful plan. I made the decision myself. The prescriptions ran out at the end of October 2023, and by February 2024, the remaining stock was gone. My GP has tracked what has happened after, but the decision was mine, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it the way I did. What I'd recommend is what I eventually got: regular blood tests, GP awareness, and a clear picture of what your markers are doing. In my case, that monitoring happened to come after rather than before. So what did the next 14 months look like? March 2024, first test off medication, total cholesterol 7. Still high, but that ratio 4.7, back to exactly where it was in 2012. 1 month off statins and azacitidine, and the ratio had actually corrected to within target. April 2025, 14 months off medication, total cholesterol 7.11. LDL down from 5.6 to somewhere I hadn't seen in years, and HDL ratio 4.7 to 4.8, sitting inside target. November 2025, 20 months off medication, cholesterol 6.77. That's lower than at any point during 11 years of treatment. The ratio 4.8. My GP looked at the November results and asked roughly whether I'd been put on something new. She hadn't seen the number move like that. I said no, same approach, no medication. She noted it. That was the extent of it, but it was the first time she'd expressed anything like surprise at the direction. Now, why did this happen? Because stopping medication made cholesterol better isn't a mechanism. It's just a sequence of events. I needed to understand what was actually going on. There's a cardiologist called Sanjay Gupta, works out of York Cardiology, not a TV bloke, and he put something in a way that stopped me in my tracks. He said, blood pressure is a scream, the body screaming that it's unhappy. And if you take the scream and make it a disease, you end up treating the blood pressure, but not addressing the root cause of the scream. That framing applies directly to cholesterol. The elevated number isn't the disease, it's the scream. And in my case, with HbA1c climbing to 47, pre-diabetic range, across the same period, the cholesterol was worsening. What the evidence now suggests to me is that insulin resistance was the underlying process running the whole time. Elevated insulin keeps fat locked in storage, drives the liver to produce more cholesterol, and shifts the lipid profile in exactly the direction mine was going. The statin was suppressing the number while the metabolic dysfunction kept producing the conditions that raised it. When I addressed that, fasting, removing ultra-processed foods, giving insulin a chance to come down, the lipid profile started moving differently. Not because I stopped medication, because the thing the medication was never treating started improving. Here's where the ratio matters more than the headline numbers. LDL cholesterol is essentially a delivery driver, dropping parcels at the wrong address inside your arterial walls where they accumulate and cause problems. HDL is the return driver, picks up the misdelivered parcels and takes them back to the liver. Total cholesterol alone doesn't tell you how busy the return service is. The ratio does. A high total with excellent HDL tells a very different story to a high total with almost no returns. Mine at 6.2 meant the return service had been getting worse for years, while the headline number was actually being managed. That's the pattern I missed for 11 years, and I only saw it when I put all the results side by side back in December 2023. In my case, N equals 1. One person, one set of blood tests, addressing the metabolic route seemed to shift things in a way that 11 years of medication hadn't. I can't say that would happen for everyone. Cholesterol is complex and individual responses vary considerably. What I can say is that the ratio tells a different story to the total, and it's worth asking your GP to talk through both. What I'd do differently, if I was starting this again, I'd track the cholesterol HDL ratio from the very first blood test, not just the headline total. The ratio is in the results. It's calculated, it's there. I just never asked about it and nobody flagged it. 11 years of that number moving in the wrong direction while I assumed the medication was doing its job. I wouldn't make that assumption again. I'd look at the ratio and ask what it means, and I'd want to understand what it was doing year on year, not just whether the total was in range. What to watch for? If you're on cholesterol medication and you have access to your historical blood tests through the NHS app or your GP records, look at the cholesterol HDL ratio across the years, not just the most recent result. If the total is being managed but the ratio has been drifting upwards, that's a question worth bringing to your GP. Not an alarm, just a conversation. Can we talk through what the ratio has been doing over time? Is a completely reasonable thing to ask. Here's the thing about this pattern, and this matters whether you're on medication or not. The process that seems to have been driving my cholesterol in the wrong direction, insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, developing quietly over years, tends to start building long before anyone measures it or names it. HbA1c drifting towards pre-diabetic range, energy not quite right, weight that doesn't shift the way it used to. These are the signals that show up in the data before a GP has a specific conversation about cardiovascular risk. The mechanism runs ahead of the diagnosis. Cholesterol being managed on the surface while something deeper is developing underneath. That pattern doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, and the earlier you notice the direction of travel, the more options you have about what to do about it. This is educational content only. It's not medical advice. Please speak to your GP before changing your diet, fasting pattern, or any medications. If you want to track your own cholesterol ratio over time, I've put together a simple blood test tracker. It pulls in the key cardiovascular markers and shows you the direction of travel across results rather than just the latest snapshot. Links in the description below.